What if a discovery was so disturbing that even science chose to look away? What if the truth was not hidden because it was unknown, but because it was too unsettling to be fully understood? Welcome to Story of the Black Past, a place where we uncover powerful and forgotten stories from history. Stories of mystery, hidden truths, and moments that challenge everything we think we know. If you are new here, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time you are watching this video. We always love to see how far our stories travel. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful stories to life. Thank you for being here. Now relax, avoid all distractions and pay close attention. Watch until the very end, because the story you're about to hear is something you will not want to miss even for a moment. Tonight we travel to the open plains of Kansas in the year 1878, a place where communities were small, distances were wide, and what happened in one home could remain unknown for longer than expected. This is the story of four brothers whose existence raised questions that were never fully answered. They lived on the edge of a small settlement, not far, but far enough to remain separate. Their home was simple, quiet, unremarkable in appearance, and yet something about it drew attention. Not immediately, but over time, because people began to notice something unusual, not in what the brothers did, but in how they were seen. At first, they appeared normal, working, moving, living as others did. But small details began to stand out. Moments where something did not fully align, a movement slightly delayed, a reaction slightly different, a presence that felt coordinated in a way that was difficult to explain. At first, it was dismissed. Coincidence. Similarity between siblings, nothing more. But the feeling did not disappear. It grew, quietly, because each time someone interacted with them, the same impression returned, that they were not entirely separate from one another, not in behavior, but in awareness. People began to speak about it, carefully, because there were no clear words, only impressions, observations that did not form a complete explanation, but suggested something deeper, something unusual. The brothers remained calm, unchanged. They did not respond to the attention, they did not try to explain, they simply existed. And that made it more unsettling, because there was no reaction, no denial, no acknowledgement, only presence. As time passed, the observations became more specific. The brothers often moved in ways that seemed synchronized, not rehearsed, not intentional, but natural, as if they shared something beyond ordinary connection, something that allowed them to act as one without communication. And that is where the questions deepened. Because connection between siblings is expected, but this felt different, more precise, more consistent, more unified. The local doctor was brought in, not to confirm anything, but to observe, to understand, to explain what people could not. He spent time with them, watched closely, tested responses, asked questions, but what he found did not give him clarity, it gave him uncertainty, because everything he observed suggested something beyond what he understood, something that did not fit within the knowledge he had. And that is where the discomfort began, because when something cannot be explained within known understanding, it creates tension. Not just intellectual, but personal, as if the limits of knowledge had been reached, and what lay beyond those limits was unclear. The doctor left without a conclusion, not because there was nothing to say, but because what could be said did not feel sufficient. The community continued to observe, but no one moved closer, because curiosity had been replaced by something else. Caution, not fear, but awareness. A quiet understanding that something about those brothers was not fully understood, and that understanding did not need to be complete to influence behavior. This was not just about four individuals, it was about something that challenged the limits of what people believed was possible, something that existed within reality, but did not fully align with how reality was understood. And once something like that appears, it does not disappear. It remains, quietly, waiting for the moment it will be questioned again, and when it is, everything begins to shift. The questions did not disappear in that quiet part of Kansas. They deepened, because once something is noticed but not understood, it does not fade, It lingers. The people in the settlement began to adjust their behavior. Not openly. Not in a way that could be pointed to, but in small decisions, shorter visits, fewer interactions, more distance, because what they felt around the four brothers was not something they could explain, but it was something they could not ignore. The brothers remained unchanged, always together, always aligned, not in obvious ways, but in subtle ones, a glance shared at the same moment, a turn made without signal, a response given before a question was fully asked, and those small moments, repeated over time, became something larger. Something undeniable. The doctor returned once more, not because he had answers, but because the absence of answers had become its own question. He observed again, more carefully this time, more deliberately. He separated them, tested them individually, watched for differences, for independence, for anything that would suggest they were separate in the way others were. But what he found unsettled him, because even when apart, something remained. Not visible, not measurable, but present. Connection that did not require proximity, a response that did not require communication. As if distance did not fully separate them, and that is where understanding reached its limit, because what he was observing did not fit within what he knew. It did not follow the rules he relied on. And when rules no longer apply, certainty disappears. He left again, this time without returning. Not because the mystery was solved, but because it could not be contained within explanation, and that is often where inquiry ends, not with answers, but with limits. The community followed that lead. They stopped asking, not because they no longer wondered, but because wondering no longer led anywhere. It only brought them closer to something they could not understand, and that closeness created discomfort. So they created distance instead. The brothers continued their lives, unchanged, unaffected, as if nothing around them had shifted, because for them, nothing had. Their reality had always been what others were only beginning to notice, and that difference remained. Quiet, constant, unresolved. This was not a mystery that could be solved. It was a boundary, a point where understanding stopped. And something else began. Something that existed within reality, but not fully within explanation. And once something like that exists, it does not disappear, it remains, quietly, at the edge of what can be known, and once that edge is reached, everything beyond it becomes something else entirely. And even now, after everything has settled into quiet, there is still one final understanding that remains, because what was observed in that small community in Kansas was never truly resolved. It was simply left behind. Not because it was forgotten, but because it could not be carried any further. The four brothers remained, unchanged, unexplained, existing in a way that did not fit within what others knew. And over time, that became accepted, not as normal, but as something that simply was, because when something cannot be understood, people eventually stop trying to define it. They learn to live around it, to acknowledge it without confronting it, to let it exist without needing answers. The community moved forward. New people came. Old ones faded, and with time, the details softened. The questions became less specific, less urgent, but the feeling remained that something had once existed there. Something that had challenged understanding, something that had reached the limits of what could be explained, and even without the details, that awareness stayed, because it had changed something, not in the land, not in the structure of the place, but in how reality itself was perceived. The brothers became less of a story and more of an idea, a quiet reminder that not everything fits within explanation, that there are moments where knowledge stops, and something else begins. Not everything is meant to be fully understood. Not everything can be measured, explained, or defined. Some things exist simply because they do, and their existence does not depend on our ability to understand them. The four brothers were one of those things, not a mystery to be solved, but a boundary to be recognized. A point where certainty ends and awareness begins. That is where this story rests, not in answers, but in that boundary, a quiet, lasting edge between what is known and what is not. And once that edge is seen, it cannot be unseen. It remains, in thought, in perception, in the quiet moments where something feels just slightly beyond understanding. And when those moments come, just like before, everything feels different. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough to remind you that some things were never meant to be explained, only acknowledged. And once acknowledged, they remain. Quietly. Endlessly. And even now, beyond every ending, there is still something that lingers, because what was witnessed in that quiet part of Kansas did not end when the question stopped. It changed form. It moved from observation into awareness, the kind of awareness that does not need details to exist, only the sense that something once stood at the edge of understanding, and that edge, once seen, does not disappear. It stays in the way people think, in the way they pause when something does not fully align, in the way certainty begins to feel less absolute. The four brothers were not remembered for what they did. They were remembered for what they revealed, that there are limits, not just to knowledge, but to how knowledge itself works, because everything people tried to use to understand them, logic, observation, separation, reached a point where it no longer applied. And beyond that point, there was nothing to hold on to, only the realization that something existed beyond it. And that realization is powerful, because it does close the story. It opens it into something larger, something that continues, not in events, but in perception. Only something to carry with you, that understanding is not infinite, that there are edges, boundaries, places where what we know no longer reaches. And when those places are encountered, they do not disappear, they remain, as quiet reminders that reality is larger than what we can define. The four brothers became one of those reminders, not through action, but through existence, and that existence was enough. Enough to shift thought, enough to change perception, enough to remain. That is where this story truly rests, not in the past, but in that awareness. An awareness that continues. And once it begins, it does not stop, because every time something cannot be explained, this story returns. Not as memory, but as recognition. And in that recognition, everything feels just slightly different, and that difference is enough to remind you that some things were never meant to be understood, only encountered. And once encountered, they never truly leave. And even now, after everything has been carried to its quietest point, there is still one final realization that remains. Because what existed in that small part of Kansas was never meant to be concluded. It was meant to remain open, not as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as a reminder, a quiet, lasting reminder, that understanding has limits. The four brothers were not the center of the story. They were the point where the story stopped making sense. And when something stops making sense, it does not disappear. It changes how everything else is seen. Because once you reach that edge, where explanation no longer works, you cannot return to certainty in the same way. Something stays with you. A subtle awareness. A shift in how you look at things. In how you question. In how you accept what seems obvious. That is what remains. Not the details. Not the events. But the change in perception, because perception, once expanded, does not shrink back. Through every moment where something feels just slightly beyond explanation, the people who lived near those brothers carried that awareness, and even as time moved on, that awareness did not fade. It became part of how the place was experienced, part of how reality itself was understood, not as something fixed, but as something that could extend beyond what was known. As this story reaches its true end, there is nothing more to uncover. Only something to understand. That not every story ends with answers. Some end with awareness, with the recognition that there is more than what can be explained, more than what can be proven, more than what can be fully understood. And once that recognition exists, it does not leave. It becomes part of everything. That is where this story rests. Not in conclusion, but in that awareness, a quiet, lasting awareness that awareness continues, waiting for the next moment it will be felt again. And when it is, just like before, everything will feel slightly different, and that difference will be enough to remind you that some things were never meant to be explained, only recognized, and once recognized, they remain. And even now, beyond every final word, there is still something that does not settle, because what was encountered in Kansas was never meant to be resolved in the way most stories are. It was not meant to give closure. It was meant to leave a trace, a quiet imprint on the way reality is understood, because once something reaches beyond explanation, it does not return to being simple again. It becomes part of a larger awareness, the kind that does not need constant attention, but is always there, in the background, in the way a person pauses when something does not fully make sense, in the way certainty no longer feels absolute. The four brothers became part of that awareness, not through action, not through explanation, but through existence, and existence alone was enough to shift something. That is what makes this story different. It does not end with understanding. It ends with expansion. An expansion of what is considered possible, of what is considered real, of what is accepted as fully known, and once that expansion happens, it does not reverse. Through thought, through perception, through the moments where something feels just slightly beyond reach, that reality is not always limited to what can be explained, that there are edges to knowledge, and beyond those edges, there is not nothing, there is something else, something that exists whether we understand it or not. The four brothers stood at that edge, and because they did, they revealed it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough for it to be seen, enough for it to remain, not in answers, but in that edge, a quiet boundary between what is known and what lies beyond. And once that boundary is seen, it cannot be unseen. It stays, in thought, in awareness, in the quiet moments where something feels just out of place. And when those moments come, just like before, everything feels slightly different. And that difference is enough to remind you that some things are not meant to be solved, only encountered, and once encountered. And even now, after everything has been carried to its quietest edge, there is still one final awareness that remains. Because what was encountered in Kansas did not belong to the past alone. It belongs to that space just beyond understanding, the place where certainty ends and awareness begins. The four brothers were never fully explained, not because no one tried, but because explanation itself reached its limit. And when something reaches that limit, it does not disappear. It changes how everything else is seen. That is what stayed. Not the details, not the observations, but the shift. A quiet shift in perception, the kind that does not demand attention, but never leaves once it arrives. Because once you know that something can exist beyond explanation, you begin to see differently, not just unusual things, but ordinary ones too. You begin to question what feels certain, to notice what once felt complete, to recognize that what is known may not be all that exists. That is the lasting impact of this story, not what happened, but what it revealed. A boundary, a quiet edge where knowledge stops and something else begins. That not all things are meant to be understood, that some exist simply to remind us that understanding has limits, and that those limits are not the end, but the beginning of something else. The four brothers stood at that beginning, and because they did, they revealed it. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. Enough for it to remain. That is where this story rests, not in conclusion, but in awareness. A quiet, endless awareness that continues, waiting for the next moment it will be recognized again. And when it is, just like before, everything will feel slightly different, and that difference will be enough. That some things were never meant to be fully known, only acknowledged, and once acknowledged, they remain.